was a professor at a university in Australia. And we were really annoyed about the way in which universities were actually so-called teaching people. And we were running a joint program for the Air Force on training consultants. And we were actually using Heutagogical principles, and we thought, well, we kind of, on a drunken night in Canberra, we had a couple of bottles of wine each, we came up with Heutagogy on a napkin. And it was really out of a frustration with the fact that universities, we saw it, and that's all we were focused on at the time, were using techniques and approaches that were really based on archaic practices from the Industrial Revolution. And the other thing that really annoyed us was that very much a non-evidence-based practice. You can't get anything more or less evidence-based than, for example, some of the lecture situations that you get in universities. And so we came up with the notion of Heutagogy as attempting to come to a scientific-based practice. And I think that for the first time in education, really, neuroscience has given us a basis for practice. And we haven't actually had a scientific basis for education for a long time. There are lots of theories and stuff like constructivism, on which this is based, humanism as well, and now connectivism. There are lots of kind of theories associated with it that underpin Heutagogy, but which have still a flimsy scientific basis. And they're based as much on anecdotal evidence as anything else. I mean, you can really enjoy reading Fourier, but in actual fact, it's more theoretical based than anything else. And Vygotsky and people like that. So that's why we came up with this notion of Heutagogy, and I think better is self-determined learning, which kind of says it all. And just to kick off the discussion a bit, I think there are two wonderful ironies regarding self-determined learning when I talk to university staff, and I'm sure it's not going to happen here, but there seems to be great irony. The first one is that whenever I talk to university staff in particular, but sometimes teachers in secondary schools, very rarely primary school teachers, they seem to get it. When I start talking to them about an evidence-based practice and start to present some of the neuroscience, the research, which actually describes how people learn, you know, what's going on with the brain. And this is a scientific basis for practice. They will still say, well, that's all very nice, but I haven't got time. Or, you know, I'm too busy, or, you know, so you get these university, the paradox, the irony is that people who work in universities are research-based in their own discipline, they're relying on research. Yet when you present a research for learning, they kind of shake their heads and go away. You know, and I think that's been a problem that's beset education for a long time, that we often ignore the science and prefer instead experience that we've had and so forth. So that's the first irony. Hello.
Hello. Sure.
Come in, Barry.
You don't really do remember me.
I do. You name on your shirt. But I do remember you.
That's the key question.
How are you?
Where was I from?
Yes, I do. Of course I know you. Remember the face. How are you?
Nice to see you.
Yeah, good. We're just getting in a full flight here. The second irony, which really gets me, and I can do this best with a story, which I apologise to Kate and Monica, as I told this morning, that I was talking about this with, in fact I was spending some time at an institution working on self-determined learning and helping them develop self-determined learning approaches. And I was having a conversation with a lecturer in nursing, actually, as it was. And she said, I don't have time for all this. And I said, okay, why don't you have time? Well, I spent until 2 o'clock last night putting together 40 PowerPoint slides for my 3-hour lecture that I'm going to give tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, and I've got no time for marking, and I've got too many students, and I'm teaching 20 hours a week, 17 hours a week, whatever it was, and I'm just flat out, I can't do this self-determined learning stuff because I'm just too busy. And I said to her, well, hang on a minute. I've put this out, I've made this challenge to pretty well every educator that I've met. I will save you time if you start to use Heutagogical practices. If you actually use self-determined learning approaches. I'll actually cut that time. You don't have, so what I said, she said, well, how would you do that? I said, well, how about you say, as an example, some problem-based learning. So you've got a 3-hour lecture. She was going to torture 40 students with these slides for 3 hours. And her argument was that's quicker and more effective than, and by the way, it would be torture because that's not how we learn, is it? The neuroscience is quite clear about how we learn. And we don't learn that way just because you told people things. Like, you're not really going to learn much from this in a sense. You might gather the information, but you're not actually learning anything necessarily. And she was going to torture them for these 3 hours. So I said, okay, how about if you design a problem-based activity in which the learners, because I hate the word students, so in which the learners will then go away and do this activity for 2 hours. And you can sit and mark your papers that you were going to do on Saturday night, when the kids have gone to bed. And they'll go and do this problem-based activity. And they'll bring it back. And they'll do their presentations and they'll write a summary of what they learned. And that summary will be a part of their assessment. And you can mark it in the class. So you're using formative rather than summative assessment. And she thought about this for a while and she said, I haven't got time for that. So I thought, well, what can you do? As a former therapist, one of the things I've learned is that sometimes you can't get people to change no matter what you do, even if they're in great pain. But I would pretty well guarantee that you could actually, because usually that's the big irony, the big argument. We haven't got time for student-centred learning, when in actual fact it frees up your time in quite dramatic ways. And so, in summary, the self-determined learning practices are about student-centred learning. How many people here have got children? Yeah, or had children? Yeah, that's right, children. Most of them got children. How do kids learn? Pardon? They're inquired, aren't they? They're scientists, aren't they? They're little scientists as soon as they come out of the womb. Yeah? How many of you taught your children how to learn? Guess what? They're hardwired, aren't they? They're like we're hardwired for language, we're hardwired for learning. So they inquire. So they're little hypothesis testers, aren't they? And it scares you to death, doesn't it? I wonder what will happen if I put my finger on that hot plate. I won't do that again. Hypothesis so they have hypotheses and they test them against the world, and they learn around people. How else do they learn?
Make mistakes.
They make mistakes. They fail. How else do they learn?
They just copy.
Pardon? They copy. They mimic. What are you saying now? The vicarious learning is one of the key ways in which we learn. Not just
they
doing.
also do learn from us though, because they learn from our feedback and they learn from other kids' feedback.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't necessarily mean a good way of learning, but they are learning like that all the time. What other people are saying, how do I fit?
Absolutely.
What do I do? How do I relate against other people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily saying that the content's right.
Yeah. No, exactly.
I mean, we learn bad things as well. We learn good things, but the actual neural pathways are being laid down because they are, they're testing out the world, they're watching it, and whatever. And certainly, reward, feedback, all those things they cement learning, and as most of us know. But they're learning by doing, and then they go to school. What happens at school? Yeah, suddenly the game changes. I must admit, primary education has changed a lot now, but the game changes. There's a guy called Fred Emery who once said that school pokes your eyes out, university teaches you Braille, and postgraduate education at universities teaches you speed reading in Braille. He was a crusty old bloke. I did his PhD on my PhD on one of his theories about cooperation among humans, and he was a crusty old bloke. And needless to say, eventually he got booted out from the university system because of his attitudes towards what he thought was archaic ways of teaching. Because Fred was one of those people that believes in human agency. Okay? And there are two types of people in the world. There are a bunch of people who believe in human agency, which is about the people design their own future. They are responsible for what they do. They're actively involved in engaging with the world. And the people who don't believe in human agency believe that you've got to tell people what to do. And if you don't tell them, they'll be in deep trouble. And not only that, if you go to the extreme, whatever environment you're born into, that's what you were supposed to be. Whereas human agency is more about this kind of the fact that we can trust people and trust their learning and so forth. So that's really at the heart of thinking. And I'll just show you a couple of slides. I'll give you some of the evidence for this here as a takeaway after we've had a bit of a discussion. But based in neuroscience, and I have to admit that's one of my biases. My big bias is that I'm not a great fan of belief systems, particularly around things like education, health, and you know, doing things because it's evidence-based. How many people here would be happy to have neurosurgery, you know, surgery on your brain, by a doctor who said, look, I've got a very new procedure that nobody's... Actually, only 2 people have done it in America, and the 2 patients died. But I think it's a really good technique, and I want to do it on you to remove this particular tumour from your brain. Or we could do this other approach, which has been used thousands of times, and it's got an 80% survival rate. A or B? Education practice based on beliefs and myths, or education practice based on science. So that's my gig, and that's my bias. And I think for the first time we actually have a science, like I said, for education that's based on neuroscience. And I'm such a nice guy that I've summarised it for you here, as I would summarise for a group of students if I was running an education program. And so basically it's based on how people learn. And we learn by exploring, by inquiring, by testing, by failing, by working with teams, working with people. The other question I've got to ask you, and then I'm going to throw it out into a bit of discussion, finish my little 10-minute TED talk, is how many of you have learnt a new hobby or skill in the last, say, 10 years? You know, you didn't go to university, but you learned a new hobby or skill, yeah. What was yours?
Argentine tango.
Sorry?
Argentine tango.
Argentine tango. Wow, that sounds great. No, I won't get you to do a demo.
Keeping chickens.
Keeping chickens, right? Any others? Yeah, Barry?
Mountain biking.
Mountain biking, so that's a new hobby for you. Painting for me. Anybody yours was?
Permaculture.
Permaculture, right. How do you think we learnt these things? What did we do? How did we go about learning this stuff? What did you do? You went out there and did it? Yeah. I guess you did that with the tango. You get out there and do it.
Made lots of mistakes.
Made lots of mistakes. Did you trip over? Fall over? Strain your back? Yeah, we made mistakes. I went online. I started painting 3 years ago. My wife's an artist, and I got bored in Cooktown once when we were up there, like I said, and I thought, I'll borrow your paints and I'll have a go, and she sort of laughed. Anyway, and I got on YouTube. I found myself a tutor who I occasionally go to. Yeah, some of you did that. You went to find a tutor. Dr. Google, TED Talks. I've got people I can buy videos on painting, magazines, whatever. How many of us designed our own learning? Yeah. So we designed our own learning. So that's how we learn. How can we translate that into our educational practice? How can we free up our time? How can we let students learn how we really learn? Because all of the things we just described are all based in the neuroscience, which I'm not going to go through. You can go read about it. But it's all based on neuroscience. That's how the brain actually works. So free up time, use a scientific basis, have a lot of fun, and you know those students that sit there with those glazed eyes? Maybe get beyond that. So that's how we learn. So that's a bit of an intro to Heutagogy. It's about self-determination. It's people having some kind of control over their own learning. Now let me anticipate one question. But what about the competencies? They've got to pass these competencies. They've got to have this basic level. And I don't know about you, but when I have the surgeon operating on me, whatever it's for, I'm always having, because of my skin, I'm always living in Australia, I'm always having lots of skin cancers off. Well, quite frankly, I want a surgeon or a doctor who I don't really care about her or his bedside manner. I want them to be really competent. But I don't want them to have a hand that looks like this. So I'm into competencies, right? I'm not the Antichrist. I'm into competencies. And there's essential knowledge and skills. They're always there. But it's the process of getting there. So instead of being content driven, can we get to those competencies, that skills and knowledge, and maybe even further than that by virtue of the processes we use. So instead of focusing too much on that, but it's still there, it's still an outcome. Right? So let me be clear at the front, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What I'm talking about is process. How can we design educational processes that really tap into the way people learn and really engage them and which, from your point of view, or our point of view, as learning leaders, I like to call us, for facilitators, is more fun for us. Over to you.